Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. And if you haven't watched my previous Authortube videos and this is your first time, then welcome and thanks for watching. But we're here to talk about books and reading and stories, and that's harkening back to my origin and the reason I'm here. That's what's coming up on today's episode of The Story Detective, and I hope you'll stick around. Robert Jones. I am a graphic artist and a writer, as well as an avid reader, and I think everything that I have striven for or accomplished in my life can be boiled down to one thing: my love of stories. I've worked with a lot of creators, many of whom were writers. The writers inspired and informed not only my writing, but my reading, because I was learning from the time I was in art school to the time that I worked in the comic industry, and people that I've met through that and in the creative and entertainment world. John Ostrander I worked with when I worked on the comic book The Punisher. John Ostrander, you may or may not know, was the person who created the Suicide Squad. In terms of stories, probably the one that stands out in my mind was when we went to lecture at an art school. There was something going on at Marvel Comics. It affected the writers most in how they did their job, and I remember one student asking John, saying, "This is terrible and unfair. How do you feel about this?" And John just said, "We're not bitter. Oh no, we are irate." I also worked with a guy whose name you may be familiar with, who wrote The Watchmen, Alan Moore. Now, I don't have a lot of stories about Alan. I worked with him on a project. It was a character named Glory. I can tell you, however, that Alan still works on an old typewriter, clacks his stories out old school. Every manuscript that he's written, he has in hard copy, stuffed in a closet. This closet is a place that if you walked into looking for a particular story, you might get lost for a week or an eternity. I also studied writing under Saul Stein. Saul Stein was very big in the industry for helping a lot of writers, a lot of famous writers. He worked with James Baldwin and Elia Kazan when he went from directing to writing. I remember going through a phase where I watched a whole bunch of old movies, like silver screen classics, and listened to a bunch of old-time radio. I like to absorb everything from different periods, and I discovered the early radio shows of The Shadow, which starred Orson Welles. There was an episode in Elia Kazan played this minor role. It was a thug named Lefty. And it seemed so random that this guy who became this famous director, then writer, would be involved in that. But like anything else, he was probably in the building. Somebody didn't show up. They pulled in whoever they had to fill those roles. And I remember at the time thinking, I wonder if Saul knows about this. This is kind of an oddity. So I emailed him and he wrote back and he had no idea. And he then told me a story of his own. He met Orson Welles and he was Orson Welles' assistant when he was doing a magic show. Everything is interconnected. All the stories are interconnected. We're all interconnected. Just by watching this video, you are falling into line with whatever interconnection by degrees of these stories that are going to affect your life. I was never what you would call a big fan of any particular creator or celebrity. There are people that I've certainly liked and been influenced by, but if I met them or fell into conversation with them, I had my questions as a creator and I approached them as such. And I think if you're on the same page with somebody, that helps to make those connections of what we have in common. Those degrees of separation lessen. I listen to a fair amount of rock from the UK because I think they take it to different levels than we do here in the States, which is more imaginative. For example, there's a guitarist and composer by the name of Anthony Arjun Lucassen. Maybe you've heard of him. He writes his science fiction stories and then he puts them to song and writes kind of a musical version of that story. And he gets vocalists from all around the world and all these different musical groups play the different roles and to sing the songs for that role on his albums, which is very interesting. I remember looking at something in one of his albums and I thought I made a connection. I think it was a connection to the movie Alien, the first one. I don't know why, but I was flipping through it. There was like an information thing with an email and I was curious about the question and I don't think I gave it much thought. I just fired off an email and then I think it was like a day later I got an email and it was from Anthony Arjun Lucassen himself. And we shared a few different emails and we talked about science fiction fiction. We talked about our favorite comic book characters, which my favorite comic book character as a kid and his was Spider-Man. So again, we kind of bonded on that and we talked and he seemed like a nice guy. So I think this is how you lessen those degrees for those of you that may be writing. And for those of you who are just reading and are fans, if you run into people and you want to talk to them on their level, don't talk like you're a fan or you're somehow beneath them, or you're going to have more separation instead of less. At least that's my philosophy. Question number 1. Why did you start this channel? I want to share my own book hauls and my own analysis of books and my love and passion for reading. I don't know if there's a better reason to start a BookTube channel. What are some fun and unique things you can bring to BookTube? I enjoy analyzing books from various points of view, from character arcs to structural criteria, and I am going to be working on a series that encapsulates that and review several books and see how they hold up. What are you most excited for about this channel? I am excited to expand what I've been doing on Authortube. I think Authortube and BookTube go hand in hand. We all have the common bond of love for the written word. Whether you're reading or writing or making videos, it's all about story. It's about the thrill of story. Question number 4. Why do you love reading? I've loved reading since I was a kid, and I had a very small town life. Where I grew up, there was not a lot of things to do. I took what was available to me and I expanded on that. And once I discovered reading, it brought me to worlds that I never imagined, whether they were places in this world or imaginary worlds. They took me to a place that I wanted to be a part of. We read because it fulfills us, and we look for that thing that stimulates our imagination that we're not getting from our friends or neighbors or co-workers. I was raised around a lot of people who were non-readers and non-creators, and I thought, how do they survive? How do these people get through life, their day-to-day, without having that creative outlet, without reading and being able to escape or to get some kind of fulfillment that feeds themselves? And I think that's probably some underlying essence of why we all came here. Interesting sidebar. I also think reading is not just a privilege or an escape, but it's a right. Now, when I grew up and didn't have bookstores in my town, there was a library. I did history research into that library, and I found out a lot about the history of literature and reading. When that library first came into my hometown, for example, they didn't even lend books out. They didn't want them to leave the library, and they wanted people to come in and read who were already educated, who were of a certain class. When that library decided to allow people to come in and take books out of any age, the people who were the custodians of the library, since it was a lot of dairy farm community, said this will be like letting the cows, in from the field and traipse through the library. They didn't want them reading. And I thought, how absurd, but also how elitistly human, because that's what we do with everything. Whether it's reading or anything that we've done in the history of the human race, we have done in such a backwards, selfish way. Question number 5. What book or series got you into reading? Again, there's a little bit of a history there, and I think the history explains what I read, so I'm going to delve a little bit into that. I started with stories when I was probably 1 or 2. My grandfather was like a storyteller of old. He constantly told me these stories, and then when my younger brother was born, he enthralled us with stories. His stories were ghost stories. So we started out with a love of horror. We watched every horror movie we could once we started getting into that, and we gave ourselves nightmares. We took horror and science fiction into comic books. Comic books were the first thing that I read. Spider-Man was my favorite superhero as a kid, and the first comic book that I bought was a Spider-Man comic book. When I saw the difference in the comic book from the cartoon that opened up Peter Parker and Spider-Man's world, I was like, wow, this is so much more in depth. So that fueled my science fiction and fantasy ideas. By the time I was in the 4th grade, the first novel I read was because there was a teacher who had a table in the corner. There were books there. They were mostly literary books. And the idea was if you read a book and you wrote a little report on it, you would get extra credit. So on our free time, the class would go over and peruse these books. The first book that I picked up and read was To Kill a Mockingbird, so I was off to a good start. And I loved that book. I was a kid, but I thought the courtroom stuff and everything that happened in there. I remember again going home to my parents who didn't read a lot and saying, I really love this book. And my father said, I saw the movie. And I said, was it good? And he's like, it's okay if you like courtroom stuff. And I was like, I do. And that led into the whole courtroom and love of crime and mystery. So things just sort of spiraled from one thing to the next of my interests. That's why I think it led me into reading so widely. I don't like to separate things from genre and different types of authors, because in one sense, every story is a mystery because it incites a question that you want an answer to. Every story is a little bit of a horror story because bad things happen to the hero that's pretty horrific within the course of any story. Every story is a literary story in that the character has to overcome something within himself to overcome whatever odds are on the outside, those exterior problems that manifest, and they usually manifest from an interior problem. Everything is connected, and that's how I started. And I think even though it was a bit of a clumsy start and having to find my own way from that small town and people that didn't usually read or create, I think it led me to pull things in and struggle, but also to take in everything and enjoy it for what it is. What questions would I ask my favorite booktubers? I guess I want to know more about what you guys read and what you enjoy. I want to see the world of books through your eyes because I think we learn from one another. And my point of view on a certain book or aspect of writing might not be your point of view, but we take it all in and we learn because we're always evolving. So I think that's, again, what a community is about. What challenges do you think starting a BookTube channel will be the hardest to overcome? I almost want to say there's nothing we can't overcome, and yet at the same time, there's always new challenges as we grow and push ourselves in new directions and try to get better at what we do, so it's a bit of a catch-22. So there's always going to be challenges. What the next one is, I'm not quite sure, but I will face it when it gets here. When did I start reading? I already touched on this in a previous question. I guess the official answer would be somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd grade is when I developed a love for reading. I always loved stories, but I really, really loved stories, and I started finding them for myself. I think it's an exploratory mission, and we all find in the world of the millions of stories out there what we enjoy and why we enjoy it, because the more we enjoy and the more we understand, the more we expand. Where do I read? Many places, actually. The game is no longer afoot. You may often find me involved in a good book. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram, or a good novel, and I'll be in my own proper element. When it's a quiet night at sea, I've got a whole chest of books back in my cabin that I got from a scallywag I made walk the plank. They're mine now. Arr! When escaping the muggles, Inkspot and I can be found reading upon the train. Before we read, perhaps a bite. Between directing the miscreants and building my Death Star, reading can be quite soothing. Alas, poor Darth, I knew him, Horatio. While taking a turn about the room, I do enjoy perusing a good book, rather. So, Yorick, what do you want to read tonight?
What do you want to read tonight?
We are readers! And the final question, what kind of books do you like to read? See that last clip back there? If you made it this far in the video, congratulations. I look forward to meeting all of you, and until we meet again, keep those pages turning. Before we read... So what do you want to do tonight? Give me work. When it's a quiet night at sea. Sounds like a bad Aussie pirate.